Let's take a look back at some of the history that came before today. The Great Apollo program, of course, was the one that took human beings to the moon. There were 11 Apollo launches from Apollo 7 to Apollo 17, and 9 of them went to the lunar surface, or went to at least around the moon and then on to the lunar surface. Some of the great men and women of space history worked in that room. Gene Kranz, Glenn Lunny, Chris Kraft, all of the giants of the space program. The rockets that launched from Pad 39A during the Apollo program were the largest rockets ever built. If you had been able to harness the power of that rocket taking off, it would have been the equivalent of running every river in America through a single hydroelectric turbine at the same moment. That was the kind of energy that was used to get these rockets off the ground and into deep space. The technology used was, of course, primitive by today's standards. This was slide rule technology, this was pencil technology, this was mental math technology, and yet it got these spacecraft to the lunar surface. The touchdown on the moon that was achieved here on Apollo 11 on July 20th, 1969, was the culmination of a promise President Kennedy made 8 years earlier, when he simply declared that we choose to go to the moon. We don't have to go to the moon. We choose to do this because we are a spacefaring people. We are a questing people. We are people who look at what's on one mountain and decide we have to get to the other mountain. We are people who look at one coast of an ocean and decide we have to get to the other side of that ocean in order to explore. It all began with these 7 men, the original Mercury astronauts. 6 of the 7 flew. One didn't because of an early heart murmur. What they went through to be qualified was not easy stuff. From the Mercury program, the one-man spacecraft, the very first launch was right here. You see it on a Redstone rocket. It was a little pop-gun suborbital flight. It's a tiny rocket. This spacecraft carrying Alan Shepard did not go into orbit. It went into what was called a suborbital flight. He had about 5 minutes above the atmosphere, about 5 minutes of weightlessness, but that was enough for America to have said it had put men in space, or it had put a man in space. There was a second suborbital flown by Gus Grissom shortly after Al Shepard's flight. The crowds that gathered to watch these launches were a sign of what this meant to the United States. This wasn't just a technological achievement. This was a geopolitical achievement. This was the United States in a bipolar world with the post-war capitalist American system on one end and the communist system on the other, and it was very much seen as a war of two ideologies. What we're looking at here was views of John Glenn, the first American to orbit the Earth on February 20th, 1962. This one-man Mercury program led to the two-man Gemini program. This was the program that allowed astronauts to test the technologies they would need to get to the moon: rendezvous, docking, spacewalks, long-duration space flights. The Gemini 7 crew, Jim Lovell and Frank Borman, spent 2 weeks sealed in a Gemini spacecraft. Right here, what we're looking at is the rendezvous between the Gemini 6 and Gemini 7 spacecraft. The very first time 2 spacecraft met in orbit. That was considered an almost impossible feat to achieve. Spacewalking in its early iterations was not a safe thing to do. If we are looking at Gene Cernan here, and it's hard to tell, this was could be the Gemini 9 spacewalk, in which Gene Cernan labeled the spacewalk from hell. He overheated. He could not see in his spacesuit. His helmet visor clouded up. But it was one way of learning what spacewalking involved, and that it wasn't simply the happy drift that people thought it was. Going forward, of course, beginning in 1981, was the shuttle program. This was the point at which the U.S. decided that we were going to make a long-term commitment to low Earth orbit, which sounded less swashbuckling than the space shuttle or than the Apollo programs, but this was our chance to live in space. This was the space shuttle was equal parts elegant and wonderfully simple. It was a space truck. It ran, as it said, shuttle runs to and from Earth orbit to bring crews up, to bring hardware up. It launched some of the greatest spacecraft in history. The Galileo probe that orbited Jupiter left from the body of a space shuttle. The Hubble Space Telescope left from the body of a space shuttle. 135 such missions made spaceflight routine. Since the grounding of the space shuttle, we have been a nation that has flown to space with the aid of the Russians aboard the Russian Soyuz spacecraft. The Soyuz has been flying since 1966. It's sort of the Volkswagen Beetle of the space program. It's tough, it's reliable, it's all but indestructible. It is a speedy cosmic sports car, and it's a heck of a machine going up and a heck of a ride coming down. Scott Kelly, who spent a year in space, said that landing in a Soyuz spacecraft is a little bit like going over Niagara Falls in a barrel that's on fire. And yet, here we see Christina Koch coming back from space after having spent nearly a year in space. What we are looking at here appears to be an early iteration of the constellation, the Aries 5. This is a simulation of the what was going to be America's return to the moon program. It was begun in 2004 by the George W. Bush administration, and the goal was to have human boots back on the moon as early as 2015. It was going to consist of two boosters, one that was a relatively small booster, the Ares 1, to take astronauts to space, and another, the Ares 5, which would take which would take cargo, rather. This was a launch of the Ares 1, the very first iteration of the very first of the constellation programs. And here again are simulations of what the lunar vehicle would have been. The Constellation program fell victim, unfortunately, to what often happens in Washington, which is that as administrations change, so too do goals. The Constellation program had gotten rather far along when the Bush administration transitioned to the Obama administration, and the Obama administration then decided to focus less on a return to the moon and more to the commercial crew program with the commercial sector, the Boeing Starliner and the SpaceX Dragon, taking over the work of getting astronauts to and from low Earth orbit, so that the space agency, the space program, so that NASA could focus on deep space exploration. And this is where we stand now, with the commercial crew program taking care of low Earth orbit, and NASA looking forward to returning to the moon with both the Artemis program and the new lunar lander being developed for the Artemis program. 3 companies have now been chosen to build that lunar lander. Blue Origin, which is the company owned by Amazon founder Jeff Bezos, SpaceX, and Dynetics, and all 3 of them are working on building a lunar lander. Meantime, what we're looking at here is the New Shepard rocket that Blue Origin hopes to use to send paying customers into suborbital space, very much like Alan Shepard's very first flight into space. Here we're seeing the Virgin Galactic spacecraft. Similarly, Sir Richard Branson's Virgin Galactic company hopes to launch paying customers on suborbital flights that will give them about 5 minutes of weightlessness above the atmosphere. Ultimately, Elon Musk, in what the images we're seeing here, hopes to launch his 150-foot tall stainless steel Starship rocket on the surface of the moon. This looks improbable, but NASA believes enough in this that this is one of SpaceX is one of the companies that's gotten a contract to help develop a lunar lander. This is Musk's next great enterprise, and Starship is where he hopes to make his mark, landing both on the surface of the moon and ultimately on Mars. We're back now to a live picture of the pad, and it looks like things may have cleared up a little bit. We will see what NASA has to tell us about where the weather stands, but the sky looks a bit bluer, the rain looks a bit subdued, and there is still a chance that we could be getting off the ground today at 3:22 p.m. We are, like the rest of the world, watching this impending liftoff today, waiting for what NASA reports will be a weather update. Weather will be the final determinant. As we can see from this angle, it does appear that the skies are clearing. Now, those are some pretty formidable clouds through which the spacecraft would have to launch, but those are some pretty promising blue patches among the clouds. And the better news is the air appears generally clearer, generally less cloudy, less foggy, and generally less rainy. So we are standing by for a weather update from NASA, which we are told will be coming momentarily. So we are here with Terry Virts, the veteran of two space flights, 2 weeks aboard one space shuttle mission, helping to build the International Space Station, and then 200 days aboard the space station involving 3 spacewalks, one stint as commander of the station, a trip made by Soyuz, the Russian Soyuz rocket. So you're a veteran of two very different kind of spacecraft. The space shuttle, which is just a big bruiser of a machine, and sort of a sports car like the Soyuz. What do you think it would be like to fly the Crew Dragon?
Well, I think it's going to be a lot more like the Soyuz. It's roughly the same size. I noticed when I flew on the space shuttle, it was like a muscle car. It was rumbling and lots of noise, and it kind of slowly takes its time getting into space. It's similar to a Saturn V in terms of weight and thrust, whereas the Soyuz was bam, and you're just up and gone. Of course, it was a nuclear ICBM, a Soviet ICBM. So they didn't want those things to sit around and look pretty. They wanted them to get going quickly. Right. So the Falcon is going to be a lot more like the Soyuz.
All credit to them if this launch goes off as we hope it will. But they are several years behind schedule, and the U.S. has been 9 years now without the ability to get astronauts to space on our own spacecraft. We're used to thinking of going to low Earth orbit as fairly routine. Why has it taken so long? Why is it so hard to get spacecraft into orbit?
Well, the easy answer is space is hard and it takes time, and you have to, work on all the technical things. But the reality is, between Alan Shepard's first flight and Neil and Buzz on the moon, that was 8.5 years. And people, there were no cell phones to help do email, and we didn't have any history. So we were quicker in the 60s than we are today. And this is SpaceX, which is probably one of the fastest rocket companies ever. I mean, they get stuff done quickly.
Right.
Part of the problem happened where Congress just underfunded the program, which takes some of the air out of this is a privately funded thing, because it was really a government funded project. And when the government didn't fund it by the full amount, that really slowed it down. Part of it is, there are problems that happened, and there's been several, serious technical problems along the way. But when I was in space, the SpaceX cargo capsule showed up a couple of times and brought my underwear and food and supplies. And that program happened really, really quickly. It was basically, I think, 2008 when the cargo contract was really going. And by 2012, they were delivering stuff to the space station. So SpaceX has shown it can get stuff done much more quickly than the old government model, but it's still not a perfect system, and it's still taking us longer in the 2010s than it did in the 1960s.
There's another competitor in this race, of course, Boeing, and Boeing's spacecraft is its CST-100 Starliner, which also will be carrying astronauts to and from the International Space Station. Now, they had a bit of a setback on their last uncrewed mission. They weren't quite able to reach the International Space Station. What do you think about Boeing's chances for getting their own crews up there, and how quickly do you think they'll be able to be flying?
Well, I think Boeing is going to do this also. It's going to take them, they're many months away. This is not going to happen next month for Boeing. It's going to take some time before they do it. They had software problems. And when I was a test pilot, I mostly worked on software programs, and I would always tease the engineers, it's only software, guys. Come on, you should be able to get this done. And the reality is software is often the hardest, longest, most complicated, part of any aerospace program. But I'll ask you this question, Jeff. Do you want to check your MySpace account later on today? The reality is, MySpace was the first to market, right, but now everybody does Facebook, right? So just the fact that you're the first to market is sometimes good and sometimes it's irrelevant. So Boeing is definitely a player in this market, if you will. Mm-hmm. The ISS program is a pretty small market. It's only 1 or 2 launches a year for each company. It's really not a big program. So the real marketplace is going to be, if we ever get to a place where there's private space stations like the Bigelow space station, or
Right.
if we ever start legitimately manufacturing in space, then companies like SpaceX and Boeing, and maybe others eventually, Sierra Nevada or who knows,
Right.
then they'll be launching 4, 5, 10 capsules a year, and not just one a year, and then it becomes interesting. So the government is kind of seeding that market, but hopefully it will eventually grow into something bigger.
And if it grows into something bigger, if we do have private space stations in orbit being serviced by private spacecraft, will they be vacation? Will they be academic? Will they be industrial? Will they be all of the above?
I think the space station has a corner on the academic market. You know, it's a government subsidized thing. That's the place for universities or companies to do research. The space station is the place for science projects, but it's not a place for manufacturing. Right. So if we ever figure out how to do 3D printing of human organs, or make microelectronics and mass scale that you can make them better in weightlessness than you can on Earth, if any of those technologies actually hit, then that's going to have to go to the Bigelow or, you know, another private space. So that's one of the markets, is manufacturing. And I think the tourism is also a very interesting idea. There's several, you know, space tourist companies, if you will. Virgin and Blue Origin are probably going to fly tourists first, maybe this year, maybe next year, but those are just suborbital. They go up and come down 5 minutes later.
That's right.
To have orbital space tourism would be amazing, but that's going to require a place like the ISS that's not exactly set up for tourists. It's a government thing. So I think that would be a really interesting marketplace. Of course, it's going to be probably more expensive than a retired astronaut or a journalist would be able to afford.
Yeah, I have a feeling I'll just be looking at someone else's vacation photos.
They're family movies.
Exactly. Elon Musk is a character. I think even Musk himself would admit that he's a bit of a character. And there's been some friction between him and NASA Administrator Jim Bridenstine in the last year or so. Are you troubled by that, or do you just see it as sort of the rough and tumble of the space business?
I'm not troubled. I thought you were going to say there's been some friction between him and everyone.
A little of that.
This is the world that we live in. I'm a lot more troubled or excited by a rocket that works or doesn't work than I am about, you know, some tweets going off. Elon has admitted that he's the kind of the king of self-inflicted wounds. If I was a shareholder, I might want my CEO to, you know, be more focused on shareholder value and not on, you know, Twitter. But that's between him and his shareholders. So the things that concern me as an astronaut, if I were flying, and I'm not, I'm retired, I don't work at NASA, I'm done. Is the rocket going to work? Is the escape engine going to work? Will the parachutes work? Will the rendezvous system work? Is the software are the computers going to work? All that's the stuff that really would concern me. And that's where I think having some transparency and making sure that you're just being open and honest with the public is more important. Some of this other stuff is just showmanship, I think.
Right. Now, before we went live here, you and I were talking a little bit about the difference between flying, say, a Soyuz and flying the new SpaceX Crew Dragon. And certainly no slur on Bob Behnken or Doug Hurley, the astronauts who will be aboard the Crew Dragon. But you said that there is a bit less flying going on with this spacecraft than there is when you're at the stick of a Soyuz or a space shuttle. Tell me a bit about that. How come?
Right. So actually, the details of it are proprietary, and I've never worked at SpaceX, or that wasn't my job back when I was at NASA. So I don't know all the details, but from what I understand, there's basically no flying involved. Everything is automated from the launch to on-orbit maneuvering. The docking is automated. During entry, there's nothing for the crew to do. The capsule does everything. There's not, from what I understand, there's not even like a control stick that you normally have to fly an airplane or a spaceship. They are going to do some manual maneuvering during docking. just to prove that the system works, because this is a test flight. So, but it's like it's a touchpad. So they're going to have a screen, and they'll be, roll left, and then the shuttle will roll left, and then pitch up, and the capsule will pitch up. Flying on the space shuttle, was designed in the 70s. Right. It was the best flying machine of all time. It was, and you could fly it, during launch. I did fly it in orbit. I flew, rendezvous, and I flew around the space station with the control stick, and back in the atmosphere, I flew it with the control stick, and like an airplane. So the shuttle, from a test pilot's point of view, there will never be anything as cool as the space shuttle, because you could really fly the thing. But this new era, it's the 2020s, and we're going to have self-driving cars. I think by the end of the century, our grandkids are going to think back and, hey, Grandpa, what was it like to have a car that you had to drive? This is just the way of things. The goal of this is not to fly it. The goal of this is to take people from Earth to the space station and back. It's just a logistical cog in the space station program. As you mentioned, we've been doing this since John Glenn and Yuri Gagarin in the early 60s. And this is just a more modern version of that. And this is not the goal. Like I said, we got to get people into space. The goal is what they do after they get to space. That's the interesting part of it. So this is kind of it's the rental car at the airport. It's not your vacation destination.
We're talking about 2024 to have boots on the moon, the first woman and the next man. Mm-hmm. In candor, are you sanguine about that? Do you think we can make that date?
Well, the Commercial Crew Program, if you will, was really born in 2009 when the Obama administration took over, and Charlie and Laurie Garver kind of ran the space agency. They announced Constellation was canceled the week I launched in space in 2010. And here it is, 2020. So that's a decade. Yeah. And we still haven't sent people just to Earth orbit in a capsule.
Right.
And we're going to be on the moon in 4 years. So I just, as a realistic person, that doesn't seem realistic at all. However, in the 60s, we did do that, right? We were able to make it happen.
Yeah.
But it's not the 1960s NASA today. So that's going to be something that's going to be very difficult. I think we also need to say, why are we doing that? And I think if it's part of a strategic plan to use the moon as a testing ground to get to Mars, if it were part of a truly strategic plan, then you do the things you need to do to, fulfill that strategic plan, rather than just say, here's a random thing and we have to do it. The other thing is the debt that we're racking up right now, Jeff, is staggering, and it's just changed the course of the next decade or two, what's happening in 2020. So we're going to have to be very strategic about money that we spend.
Right.
So I think there's just a new reality that we're in.
Right. And that brings us to the always somewhat touchy area of politics. For our viewers, you mentioned Constellation, which was, of course, the lunar exploration program that was established under the George W. Bush administration. And there was a fair amount of progress, a good amount of progress that was made on that. And then it was canceled under the Obama administration. And the Obama administration had a number of its own policies, including the asteroid redirect mission, moving an asteroid closer to Earth, and then studying it. Now, under the Trump administration, we are back on the lunar course. Do you worry that whatever happens in November, the Trump administration will either end then or it will end in 4 years? That's not much time either way.
Right.
Do you worry that we will once again shift course and start all over and have a new program that will have to be begun from scratch?
Right. One of the things, while I was an astronaut, you fly and then you go visit Congress and the White House. I've been there several times. And now that I'm retired from being an astronaut, I've spoken at the National Space Council with the Vice President. And I talk to folks often. And the one message I always have for them is it's not about the rocket science, it's about the political science. And the way to run a space program is not change what the last guy did because you don't like him. And that's It's what we've been doing now for more than a decade. So the political system's broken in so many ways. NASA is just 1% of a really messed up political system, right?
Right.
So I think the hope for me is that private companies can put together a plan. I think if we can figure out how to do private-public partnerships, right? And I know Mr. Bridenstine's been really focused on that, and that I know this is a priority for him. But let Blue Origin, just let them go. Let SpaceX go. Let Sierra Nevada go. Let these other companies and Boeing and Lockheed. They can do things privately, and when they are allowed to do that, they can be more efficient too. So, I think if we can figure out how to let these companies do things, and let the government do things like make treaties, bring in Russia, bring in Europe, bring in other countries to work. Eventually, we're going to need nuclear power. Government's going to have to do that. SpaceX is not going to make a nuclear reactor. So, I think if we figure out how to do that right, that can help us moderate, attenuate some of this political ups and downs that we have. Because otherwise, it's never going to happen. And the SLS, that rocket really was born in 2005 when George W. gave his vision for space exploration.
Right.
It was going to use cheaper engines. It was going to be, they weren't going to have a capsule on it. It was going to just be the cargo ship. It was part of an integrated plan. Yeah. And then that got canceled and changed. And that was 15 years ago. And it's still years and years away from launching people. So.
Yeah, I remember at the time in 2005 when it was announced, the target date was footprints on the moon, maybe as early as 2015. Well, that's 5 years ago. We're still not back in low Earth orbit.
I think Air and Space Magazine did an article. I was one of the next astronauts on the moon. I was one of the guys they featured, along with some of the, I think Megan, Behnken, and Karen Nyberg, actually. Yeah. Bob and Doug's wives, I think they were in there too.
Would you suit back up to go to the moon?
You know what? To go to the moon, yes, of course. The one, I had this do I stay or leave calculus that I went through at NASA, and I had kind of done everything there was to do. I was the station commander and shuttle pilot and blah, blah, blah. So there was other things I want to do in life. But I always said if I could go make a film in space, that's something I would like to do.
Yeah, yeah. Well, now there's talk of that happening. There's talk of Tom Cruise shooting aboard the International Space Station. So. So maybe you can co-star with Tom Cruise. Well, is there anything else that I have neglected to ask you that you think our viewers would want to know about what the stakes are this week and what it feels like to be Bob Behnken and Doug Hurley climbing into this machine?
I can say that when I flew on both of my flights, it was really exciting. The very first time I suited up for my first flight, it ended up being canceled for weather, and we launched again the next day. And that first time it was like I was out of my element. I was nervous. I was in this big suit. Even though I practiced it, it really was kind of, okay, this is something different. But the second night I went out, I felt a lot more comfortable, and it was almost like I'd already done it, even though I hadn't. So the nerves were better that second time. Bob and Doug aren't going to have that because they've both flown, they've flown several shuttle missions. It's been a decade since they've flown. Yeah. But I don't think that's going to be a problem. Also, on my first flight, my first 2 days were miserable. I had the worst headache of my life. I was taking ibuprofen, and it was on my third morning. I remember Steve Robinson said, "Hey, how are you feeling?" And I was like, "God, I feel like crap." And then literally a few minutes later, it was like a light switch, and all of a sudden I was fine. Yeah. And then I was fine the rest of the time. On my second flight, even though it was 4 or 5 years later, I felt fine. Like your body just needs a couple days to figure out what the heck just happened. Right. Your inner ear fluids and everything. Yeah. For some reason, your brain figures it out. And at least for my case, and I've heard others say the same thing, I felt okay. And so my guess is that they're going to feel okay because this isn't their first space flight.
Right. You told me something once, speaking about spacewalking, about what it's like to step out into that void, and every one of your rational brain cells tells you that you cannot fall. You are in orbit. Physics is keeping you up there.
Right.
But look down, and there's nothing below you but a planet 250
Right.
miles below you. Describe that experience a little bit.
So on my first spacewalk, when I went outside, it was nighttime on Earth, but the station was up in the sunlight.
Right.
So that actually helped, because when it's daytime on Earth, you see the Earth going by, and several of my colleagues had said, "Man, I got vertigo when I went outside." I didn't think I would, but I wasn't sure because it was my first time. So I went outside. The very first thing I did, there's a waist tether on the side. I pulled it off. I clipped it on a handrail, and I let go. So I was in outer space, floating above Earth, and I just looked down, I looked around, I went, okay, I'm fine. I just wanted to make my brain behave and make sure it was okay.
Yeah.
Personally, I don't like ledges. I hate standing on the edge of a building or something like that. I hate it. And so whenever I'm on a bridge or on a building, I always walk right over to the edge.
Yeah.
Just to force myself to do it, because I don't like it. It's almost like I'm just having to beat my brain into submission, and but I still feel, I'm like, ugh. Yeah. If I'm in a fighter jet flying upside down, I'm fine because I'm strapped in and it's okay. If I'm standing on a ledge, so that was it. That was my way to try and get my brain, like as you so well described it. Every rational brain cell knows you're okay, but it's the emotional brain cells that don't necessarily know that.
You've got a book coming out soon. Tell me a little bit about that.
I do. Well, we both do. But my next book is going to be called How to Astronaut. It's a collection of 51 short essays. The goal is to laugh and to say, wow. Those are the two things that I hope to get by it. I wrote it myself, no ghostwriters. And it's some basic stuff like, how do you learn how to be a doctor? How do you learn how to launch in a space shuttle? It's some crazy stuff like, what do you do if the engines don't light and you're stuck in orbit? Or what do you do with a dead body if your crewmate dies? Or, are there aliens? And so it's some stuff that is expected, some stuff that's not expected. You can pick it up and read it. Any chapter, it doesn't have to go in order. It's just a collection of essays. And I think it's going to be pretty fun. It's a good beach read when you go to the beach this summer. Coming out September 15th. So they've started doing pre-sales now.
Terrific. Congratulations on that. And thank you very much for spending time with us, Terry Virts, veteran of 2 space flights and former commander of the ISS. Not bad.
Thanks, Jeff. Looking forward to this launch.
Thank you. So am I.
And welcome back. For those of you who are just joining us, we are now T-minus 1 hour, 1 minute, and 40 seconds from launch. We are awaiting a weather update from NASA. At the moment, the skies look clear. It appears that the torrential downpours of earlier in the day have ended. The winds do not seem too challenging. So the hope is that we will see that swing arm, the access arm that connects the spacecraft to the gantry, move back soon. There will be at 2:25 in about 5 minutes an Air Force One flyover carrying the President and the First Lady, who will be here to watch the launch and later to make some comments in the vehicle assembly building. The Vice President, who was here yesterday, will not be here, or who was here on Wednesday, rather, during the first attempted launch, will not be here today. President Trump will not be the first president to watch a launch live, though he will be one of the first. The only other two were President Nixon, who in November of 1969 watched the Apollo 12 crew launch for the second lunar landing, and much later in October of 1998, President Clinton watched John Glenn on his great return to flight. Here in this shot, we see former President Lyndon Johnson and then Vice President Spiro Agnew at the launch of Apollo 11, but President Nixon, who had been in office for just 6 months at that point, did not attend. He did, as you can see, attend the return of the crew. He was on board the USS Hornet when they were recovered. And this, you can see here, President Clinton and First Lady Hillary Clinton, watching the launch of Senator Glenn, and here is President Michelle Obama visiting the space station or the Space Center earlier in the decade. Once again, here is rollout footage. And for those folks who are joining us on YouTube, here we have the presidential flyover, Air Force One, bringing the president and the First Lady to the launch facility where they will watch the takeoff that we hope will be coming now in 58 minutes and 52 seconds. For those of you who are joining us on YouTube, there is a comment section in YouTube. We would love to answer any questions, respond to any comments you have. One question that came in from a viewer earlier was how long it will take the astronauts to get to space. And the remarkable thing is this is just a 12-minute ride from the surface of the Earth in a 1G gravity sphere, gravity well, to low Earth orbit in 0G. The astronauts, Bob Behnken and Doug Hurley, will make that transition in just 12 minutes. Now, it will take them 19 more hours inside their spacecraft to catch up with the International Space Station, but only 12 minutes to go from Earth to orbit. It is a hot, fast sprint. Once those engines light, these guys are truly hauling the mail. The astronaut's day is a complicated one. We're looking at some scenes here from Wednesday when the launch was scrubbed. This is Bob Behnken, and that's Doug Hurley, and Bob Behnken being suited up in the same suit-up room that was used in the Apollo program, and some of that equipment, some of that off-green equipment on the back wall is the original hardware that was used back then. It's still being used now. It's relatively simple stuff. You can see those old analog meters. Once the crew is suited up, they are made ready to get to the launch pad. They are carrying, as you can see, the umbilicals here. They have air conditioning systems. Since these spacesuits are essentially self-contained spacecraft, they need their own kind of coolant system. We see here the two astronauts speaking to both Elon Musk and on the right, and Jim Bridenstine, the administrator of NASA, on the left. These are the two men who are most responsible for what will happen today. The walkout happened on Wednesday very nominally. This is how it's supposed to look. A lot of waves and blown kisses to friends and family. The backup crew is there with them as well. Typically, backup crews are there until the very last moment, always ready to be available in the event an astronaut would not fly. Here they were climbing into the Gull Wing Tesla, getting ready to go out to the launch pad, saying goodbye to their wives and children. Again, you notice they are standing behind a yellow line, and it's only pantomime hugging going on here. This was the case even before the COVID pandemic. Astronauts have always been put into some kind of pre-flight quarantine to keep them from carrying any pathogens up to the International Space Station, but particularly in the age of COVID, we do not want this new virus making it off the ground and into space. One correction from earlier, that was not today's Air Force One flyover that we showed you. That was footage from Wednesday. Apparently there will not be a flyover today. The President and the First Lady are coming in via Air Force One, but there won't be the same kind of flyover for the press and the spectators. The crew plugged in their environmental control systems from their spacesuits into a similar environmental system in the Tesla on the way out to the launch pad. We are told they listened to a mixtape on the way out that included the Blues Brothers, AC/DC, and the Star Spangled Banner to get them in the mood for this most American of missions, the first time American astronauts will be launching aboard an American rocket from American soil since July of 2011, when the shuttle Atlantis made the final trip to the into orbit to service the International Space Station. We are now at T-minus 51 minutes and 55 seconds, and we just got word from NASA that the escape system, the rockets that would pull the spacecraft away from an exploding Falcon 9 in the event of an emergency, are being armed, which is a good sign. That means they are preparing for launch. Much more important, the fueling that will take place about 30 minutes before launch, loading on those 76,000 gallons of liquid oxygen and kerosene into the spacecraft, or into the rocket rather, are also on track to proceed on time. So these are both good signs. Again, we are still close to an hour away. Weather can do a lot of funky things in an hour, and we have no way of knowing with any certainty if this mission will get off on time. But those are two very promising signs that they are going ahead with these two very important milestones, arming the escape system and fueling the rocket in anticipation for launch.
White Room, which was the last place we saw them standing up before they climbed inside Dragon. And again, a wider shot there of Launch Complex 39A, where we are inside of an hour from liftoff, and I think we're just a couple minutes away from the pull we're going to hear before they start propellant load. Again, a two-stage rocket there. And gosh, you guys, the weather looks not that bad. I mean, obviously that is not an official forecast, but it doesn't look quite as bad as it did Wednesday. We've got a little bit better odds. So there's the countdown clock. We're going to pause to listen to that comm.
We've gotten a number of questions from viewers about how we keep space coronavirus free. An important lesson was learned in 1968 when the Apollo 7 astronauts all caught head colds on a miserable 11-day mission. COVID is much more serious than a head cold, but protocols that were put in place back then are still in place today to keep any spacecraft disease-free. So let's take a look at how space is being kept COVID-free in this time of pandemic.
There's no better way to escape the coronavirus that's stalking the world than to leave the world altogether. Astronauts Bob Behnken and Doug Hurley will be doing that when they take off aboard a Crew Dragon spacecraft for a flight to the International Space Station. But before leaving, they had to ensure they weren't carrying the virus aloft with them. That meant quarantine, or crew health stabilization, as NASA calls it. For decades, NASA astronauts have quarantined before traveling to space, but that's not the way it always was. In the early days of the Mercury and Gemini programs, the idea of isolating the one- and two-man crews before flight was considered ill-advised and even impossible. There was just too much work for them to do to indulge any worries about colds and flus. All of that changed after the flight of Apollo 7, when astronauts Wally Schirra, Don Isley, and Walt Cunningham came down with severe head colds early in what turned out to be a miserable 11 days in space. By the time of the Apollo 8 lunar orbit mission, a 21-day pre-flight quarantine protocol was put into place. The crew was scheduled to launch December 21st, 1968, which should have meant quarantining from December 1st on. But President Lyndon Johnson had other ideas, and on the evening of December 9th, he held a dinner at the White House honoring the crew and the rest of NASA. That meant a late start on quarantining, with the 21 days cut to just 12. For the first 3 of the 6 successful lunar landing missions, Apollos 11, 12, and 14, there was not only a pre-flight quarantine, but 3 more weeks of isolation afterwards to ensure that the astronauts were not carrying any lunar pathogens back with them. By the time of Apollos 15, 16, and 17, NASA, reassured that lunar pathogens didn't exist in the first place, lifted the post-flight part of the lockdown. The three crews that flew to Skylab, America's first space station in the 1970s, had a longer 3-week pre-flight quarantine period in keeping with the longer stretch they'd be spending in space. The shuttle crews got a break. Just a week of pre-flight quarantine, 3 days spent at crew quarters at the Johnson Space Center in Houston, and 4 spent in similar accommodations at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida. With the coronavirus at large, Behnken and Hurley were assigned a longer 12-day quarantine period, 5 days in home isolation and 7 at Cape Canaveral. They and the few technicians and medical personnel who have come into contact with them during quarantine were also required to have 2 negative coronavirus tests in order for the crew to be certified fit to fly. Where humans go, at least some germs hitch a ride with us. The key is to ensure as few as possible accompany us to space.
And here we are at last seeing that swing arm moving away from the spacecraft. Bob Behnken and Doug Hurley are now very much on their own, with the exception, of course, of the tens of millions of people in the world watching their mission and the hundreds and even thousands of controllers on the ground around the country and around the world who are helping to keep them safe. So in that sense, they are not at all alone, but physically they are there without their support team, without their white room crew. It's just 2 men in that spacecraft getting ready to take off. We are now at T minus 39 minutes and just 7 seconds. We are awaiting a shot of the presidential motorcade. The president and the first lady departed the White House at 12:10 p.m. today and arrived at the shuttle landing facility at 2:25, just 20 minutes ago. So they will be moving over to the operational support building next, where they will be, from which they'll be viewing the flight. Meantime, the skies continue to clear. The weather continues to look as if it is going to cooperate, and it only needs to cooperate for another 38 minutes and 25 seconds, after which Florida is free to do what Florida does, which is for the weather to become turbulent again. We just need these skies, these conditions to hold for now under 40 minutes. And as we see this rocket and this spacecraft on the launch pad, it's worth mentioning again just how extraordinarily well designed and engineered the machines are. The Falcon 9 rocket itself stands 229 feet tall. It's fueled by 9 Merlin engines using RP-1 rocket fuel, which sounds pretty glamorous, except RP-1 rocket fuel is pretty much just high-intensity kerosene, and that's mixed with liquid oxygen as the oxidizer. Each of the 9 engines produces 125,000 pounds of thrust for an overall 1.125 million pounds. The Falcon 9 first flew on June 4th, 2010. It's been an operational vehicle for a decade now. This will be the 84th launch of a Falcon 9, and significantly one of the things that distinguishes the Falcon 9 from virtually every other, or actually every other expendable rocket that does fly, is that when its first stage is spent, it's not simply dumped in the ocean as a use once and throw away piece of hardware. Instead, the first stage lands on a barge near the Space Center, and there have been so far 44 successful such landings, and 31 of these first stages have been successfully refurbished and reflown. The Dragon spacecraft itself that the astronauts will be flying in is sort of, think of it as the Apollo-era spacecraft on steroids. It's about as wide as the Apollo was, about 13 feet wide, but it's twice the height at 26.7 feet tall. It has significantly more habitable space than the Apollo did, which carried 3 men and something close to moderate comfort and moderate discomfort. This spacecraft is capable of carrying a crew of up to 7 men and women, although there will only be 2, obviously, this time. There are 16 thrusters right around the spacecraft that allow it to perform the delicate choreographic maneuvers it will need to perform in order to dock with the International Space Station, to reorient itself for re-entry, and to do all of the other maneuvering that is necessary during space flight. There have been 22 launches of a Dragon spacecraft, the cargo version of a Dragon so far, and 21 visits to the International Space Station. It is almost all automatic. Obviously, the astronauts are highly trained in order to take over at any point. The instrument panels are all touch screens, very different from the mechanical toggle switches and dials of the old Apollo era. And the crew is perfectly capable, eminently capable of flying the spacecraft on their own if any of the automatic systems fail to work. When they come home, they will land under the power of 2 small drogue parachutes and 4 main chutes. The Dragon, like the first stage of the Falcon rocket, is reusable. This is all in an attempt to ensure that that prices can be kept down and assembly can be complete. And what we just saw here, what we're seeing here, is a test of the escape system that was conducted last year to prove that the Dragon could successfully separate from a rocket that was threatening to explode. So we're working with 2 reliable machines today, 2 machines that have a very proven track record. The one thing they have not done until today, we hope, is carry human beings, and we are inside of 33 minutes now until the point at which that important milestone may at last be crossed. The presidential motorcade is now approaching. We should be able to see that soon. The weather looks calm, as you can see from the inset image on the left. The sky is rather blue, and as you can see in the top right corner, that windsock, that orange windsock at the top of a light pole does not seem to be getting pushed by much wind at all. So we have what appear from these decidedly non-scientific measures here, clear skies and low winds, and this is what you would want to see. The president and the motorcade should be arriving momentarily around this bend that we can see in the image here. The president will view the launch. He will arrive just about 8 minutes before launch time at 3:25 for the, or rather at 3:17 for the 3:22 launch, and will then go to the vehicle assembly building at 5 p.m. to address NASA workers and a number of the people responsible for what we hope will be today's launch. You see the motorcade arriving now. This is part of a long tradition of presidents making sure that they are present either at launches or at recoveries in order. There's politics involved, certainly. There is nothing wrong with doing the touchdown dance when something momentous like this happens under your administration. But also all presidents, going back to President Eisenhower, who was the president who founded NASA, have known that space travel is as much about technology and exploration as it is about politics and funding. And it's important for presidents, for any administration, to be there, to wave the flag, to show the colors, to make it clear that they are behind this enterprise. Traveling in space is expensive. Traveling in space is dangerous. And it's important for presidents to show that they are in support of this program and that they are backing it. And President Trump is there very much today to enjoy what looks like it could be a successful launch which is now just 29 minutes and 15 seconds away. And it appears as if fueling of the rocket has now begun. You can see some of that condensation from the liquid oxygen that is part of the fuel mix subliming out of the spacecraft. This is the first crewed launch that it uses what is known as the load and go process. Typically, the rocket is fully fueled, and only then does the crew climb aboard. That was considered a safer way to go. But with the design of the Falcon 9 rocket, the supercooled and highly condensed fuel cannot sit in the tanks too terribly long before it begins to lose its efficiency, at least its efficiency within the system as it's designed for the Falcon 9. And for that reason, the fuel is kept in the tanks for as short a time as possible. Consider this a little bit like when horses load into the gate in any horse race. Horses will not tolerate a gate very long, which means once they're there, the race is about to begin. Fuel in this rocket will not tolerate lying idle in a tank terribly long. That doesn't mean it's going to blow up. It just means it's going to lose some of its energy potential. And for that reason, once the fuel is in the rocket, it is going to go. The astronauts boarded so long ago, hours ago now, which is very much a part of the process. It takes a great deal of last-minute work to get environmental systems up, to get crew checklists gone through, to drill what the final maneuvers are going to be. Crews are very accustomed to spending time flat on their backs in their spacecraft. As Doug Hurley said in the earlier piece we saw in NASA, for his shuttle flights, he was accustomed to spending as much as 4 hours on his back. One thing about fueling, it's interesting to think, we think of rockets as great machines that happen to be filled then with fuel, much the way your car is, 95% the weight of the vehicle, and you add a few extra pounds when you fill your tank. A rocket is quite a different thing. A rocket is something like an egg, with the shell as the rocket itself actually the lightest part of the entire assembly. It's the fuel that weighs the most. A Saturn V rocket, unfueled, weighed about 1.5 million pounds. Fully fueled, it weighed 6.5 million pounds. So you had fuel weighing more than 3 times the weight of the rocket. Think of a rocket as an empty vessel that is a machine that is used to process the fuel that fills it. The load and go process is underway now. It should complete not long before launch. It does not take all that long to pump even 76,000 gallons of fuel into a 229-foot machine. So with this fueling coming, it means we are in the final stages, just 24 minutes and 40 seconds now away from launch. And we have a question from a viewer as to why the launch time is so precise, why we have what's called an instantaneous launch. You either launch at 3:22 or you don't launch at all. Why can't we push it 20 minutes? In fact, if you were launching into any old orbit with any old spacecraft, you could do that. It wouldn't make terribly much difference. But it's a very delicate ballet between the International Space Station, which is in a 51-degree orbit relative to the equator at 250 miles above Earth. It's a very delicate dance between that spacecraft and the Dragon, which will have to launch from 28 degrees, then quickly move to a 51-degree inclination, and then orbit the Earth 13 times in order to catch up with the space station, essentially to intersect the orbit. Think of it as a series of spirals. The Crew Dragon will launch, and it has to spiral out carefully until it reaches the space station's orbit. If you launch even a second or two too early or too late, you miss that intersection point. So basically, the Crew Dragon is aiming for where the space station will be 19 hours and a handful of minutes from right now. And you cannot miss that launch by more than a second or two, otherwise you will fall short of or fly wide of the space station. And it's worth reminding ourselves and it's worth reminding ourselves and our viewers one last time about what SpaceX had to do to get to this point. This is a momentous day for the for a private company launching astronauts, launching NASA astronauts, and they had to go through a great deal to ensure that their systems were reliable, that their hardware was reliable, and that they could get crews safely away from a rocket that was threatening to explode. The two great tests that they had to go through were the so-called pad abort test, when the spacecraft was on the launch pad and fired its escape engines to prove that it could get away from a rocket that was threatening to go awry. and later a launch abort test in which a Dragon crew vehicle was actually launched atop a Falcon 9 rocket, and the Falcon 9 rocket was deliberately destroyed. An instance before it was destroyed, the Dragon spacecraft was capable of firing its escape engines and taking the astronauts to safety in the event of any kind of such eventuality today. And here we're looking now at this pad abort test. This was a test. Those engines that took that spacecraft off the ground would be the ones that would pull it away from a faulty rocket should any kind of accident occur. It would separate from the service module and it would release its parachutes, and the astronauts would then descend safely into the ocean. This, of course, is one of the reasons also that Cape Canaveral is the place from which we launch. We launch east over the ocean, which means that any accidents with rockets will fall harmlessly into the ocean and not toward population centers. It's also the reason that Russia, which does not have the same access to the same kind of warm water coastline at a low latitude, launches from Baikonur, which is very much desert. Here it looks like we're looking at the launch abort test in which a Falcon 9 was launched and then deliberately destroyed. Let's see if that's indeed the footage we're watching. But this was one more test to prove that the spacecraft could get safely away from a rocket that was in distress. And yes, here we see the spacecraft separating. Under these circumstances, the onboard systems would have sensed that the rocket was in trouble. It would have gotten the astronauts away, and that explosion of the rocket would have happened far behind where the astronauts were. On earlier spacecraft, the Mercury and Apollo spacecraft, there were escape towers on the top of the spacecraft that would pull the spacecraft away from the from the rocket. On the Dragon, there are escape rockets at the base of the Dragon itself that push it away from a rocket in distress. Either way, it keeps the astronauts safe.
Stage 2, LOX load started.
And we see to the left here a lot of dignitaries on the balcony of the OSB building watching as the launch is about to take place. There are astronauts here. There are military folks here. General John Raymond, the head of the newly launched Space Force, is here. This is in lieu of the much more crowded viewing stands that would typically be the place from which launches were watched, but for the COVID pandemic. Of course, looking at this balcony, we're not seeing a whole lot of people wearing face masks. We're not seeing a whole lot of people socially distancing. This coronavirus may not be the immediate news of today, but if this launch goes successfully in 13 minutes and 14 seconds, ignition will have happened. 12 minutes afterwards, the astronauts will be in orbit, and then all of us will have to go back to our everyday lives, which include the coronavirus. This should not be meant to diminish the success of today, but it is a reminder that we are about to achieve, it looks like we're about to achieve, may achieve something extraordinary in a time of extraordinary problems. And the launch will be a pleasant break from that, but it's a reminder also that we must continue to take the virus seriously. And if you are just joining us, we are now inside of 11 minutes to launch, T-minus 10 minutes and 54 seconds. The rocket is fueled, as you can see from the vapor subliming off the side of the rocket. That is the liquid oxygen. That is the supercooled liquid oxygen. That is one of the two fuels that's used. Supercooled cryogenics, liquid oxygen actually adds weight to a rocket, not simply because of the weight of the fuel. It actually causes the humid Florida air to condense against the side of the rocket and form a thin ice shell. The Saturn V, in the time it would sit on the launch pad, used to gain about 1,200 pounds just in ice forming on the side of the rocket. There's probably a little bit of that happening on the Falcon 9 rocket today. The fueling is complete. The astronauts are in what is effectively the terminal countdown now, just awaiting ignition and awaiting for the precise moment when the International Space Station, orbiting 250 miles above at about 17,150 miles an hour, moves into precisely the right position for the SpaceX Falcon 9 rocket to light its engines and begin what will be a 19-hour chase between the two astronauts in the Dragon and the station itself. That will culminate tomorrow morning, shortly before noon, in a docking at the station.
Know that we're with you. Have an amazing flight and enjoy those views of our beautiful planet.
Thanks, Jay. It is absolutely our honor to be part of this huge effort to get the United States back in the launch business. We'll talk to you some more, but thank you.
Copy all. Thanks for those words. and enjoy those views of our beautiful planet.
Starting TVC hydraulic press. Stage 1 and Stage 2 engine chill has started. Engine hydraulics at pressure.
And on the viewing stand, it's hard to see in the image we have, but
Stage 1 fuel is closed out.
President Trump and Vice President Pence are both there, along with NASA Administrator Jim Bridenstine. It's unclear if Elon Musk, head of SpaceX, is with them, but the President and Vice President are present. The First Lady is there as well, and Jim Bridenstine, a former congressman, appointed as NASA Administrator by President Trump in 2017, replacing previous Administrator Charlie Bolden. It is Administrator Bridenstine who has been charged now with the job of overseeing the Commercial Crew program, as well as the much more ambitious Artemis program, which is intended to land the first woman and the next man on the surface of the moon in 2024. But today their minds are less on the moon and more on this immediate launch, which is now inside of just 4 minutes away.
Vehicle tanks pressing for strong back retract.
Strong back retract has started.
Stage 2 RP1 bleed. Stage 1 RP1 bleed. AFTS final setup started. MVAC igniter purges. Logo bleed.
Dragon has transitioned to terminal count and is on internal power.
Stage 1, LOX load closed out. Vehicle is transitioning to internal power. Stage 2, LOX load is closed out. Propellant fills are complete.
Dragon is in auto idle.
Ground gas closeout is starting.
Falcon 9 is in startup.
Dragon is in countdown.
FTS is armed for launch.
Dragon, SpaceX, go for launch.
SpaceX Dragon, we're go for launch. Let's light this candle.
T-minus 30 seconds.
Stage 1 tanks pressing for flight.
T-minus 15 seconds. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. Ignition. Liftoff of the Falcon 9 and Crew Dragon. Go NASA. Go SpaceX. Godspeed, Bob and Doug.
Vehicle pitching downrange.
1 Alpha.
Copy, 1 Alpha.
Stage 1 propulsion is nominal.
Falcon power and telemetry nominal.
M1D throttle down.
Vehicle is supersonic.
M1D throttle up.
Max Q.
1 Bravo.
Copy, 1 Bravo.
Start of MVAC engine chill. M1D throttle down. Eco.
2 Alpha.
Falcon stage separation confirmed.
Copy, 2 Alpha.
MVAC ignition.
Acquisition of signal lofts.
Stage 2 propulsion is nominal.
Dragon SpaceX nominal trajectory.
And we have seen now
Signal Bermuda.
the
SpaceX Dragon nominal trajectory.
we've seen separation of the first stage booster, which should now be on its way to recovery on the ocean barge for reuse. On the left, we're seeing a view inside the spacecraft. To the right, we're seeing looking back toward the end of the
Stage 2
spacecraft,
propulsion is still nominal.
the tail end of the spacecraft, as that second stage engine continues propelling the astronauts to space. They are in a much smaller and much lighter vehicle than they were when they left the ground. The first stage is now gone. What is happening now is all about increasing acceleration. The crew is going to feel a maximum of 3 Gs on this flight, which is not terrible to the average person. That would be quite a lot. The average 150-pound person would feel like he or she weighed 450 pounds, but these astronauts are accustomed to eating 8 and 9 Gs in a simulator. What we should be seeing on the right now is a scene from the first stage, which is descending from midway toward space back toward the ocean. That appears to be what we are seeing. To the left is the view that you would see if you were behind Bob Behnken and Doug Hurley, looking toward the instrument panel and the windows in the front of the spacecraft. The first stage on the right is in something close to controlled freefall now. It will not reignite its engines for landing until it gets closer to the ground, but attitude control thrusters along the flank of the booster keep it aligned and keep it
SpaceX nominal trajectory.
keep it moving steady. When you hear nominal trajectory, that is all good news. Nominal in this case means exactly as you want it to be. On the right, you can see the thrusters now beginning to fire on that first stage as it slowly descends toward Earth. It is falling at a speed at this point, of course, that would not allow it to survive reentry, but it will.
Stage 2 propulsion is still good.
It will reignite its engines. S2 propulsion, as they just said, that's stage 2 propulsion. That means the second stage.
SpaceX nominal trajectory.
That means the second stage of the rocket is still
Dragon
proceeding
copy,
to fire.
nominal trajectory.
Hey, John, not the PTZ.
Acquisition of signal, New Hampshire.
Stage 2 FTS is saved.
And now we can see those first stage engines have reignited as the first stage descends toward its landing barge. It is just about to penetrate through the cloud tops, and landing on the barge should be less than a minute away, though it's a little hard to tell from this perspective. It all depends on the exact height of that cloud
Terminal
ceiling.
guidance.
And back throttle step.
Shannon,
Copy, Shannon.
And back throttle step. And back shutdown.
Dragon SpaceX nominal orbital insertion.
Launch escape system is disarmed.
Dragon copies, nominal orbital insertion.
Those are some sweet words, nominal orbital insertion. The Dragon spacecraft is in orbit. Unfortunately, the signal, then we are seeing on the left that not only is the Dragon spacecraft in orbit, but the first stage of the rocket has successfully landed on
Acquisition of signal, Newfoundland.
has successfully landed on the barge that is playfully named "Of Course I Still Love You," welcoming the first stage back. The crew is in orbit. The first stage is recovered. The first launch is 2011.
Also signal, Wolves.
And at this point, what we are seeing is a surprisingly controlled mission control room
Dragon separation
in Hawthorne, California, where the flight controllers seem relatively calm given the enormity of what they've just accomplished. Separation of the lower stage of the second stage engine of the spacecraft is now complete. The Dragon is independently in
Dragon
orbit.
SpaceX, with that separation call, we have a few words for you from our Falcon 19.
Let's listen in on this.
Dragon, Chief Engineer on Dragon to Ground. Bob Doug, on behalf of the entire launch team, thanks for flying with Falcon 9 today. We hope you enjoyed the ride and wish you a great mission.
Congratulations to you and the F9 team for the first human ride for Falcon 9, and it was incredible. Appreciate all the hard work, and thanks for the great ride to space.
Copy all.
Power and Mike, proud of you guys and the rest of the team. Thank you so much for what you've done for us today, putting America back into low Earth orbit from the Florida coast.
Copy all. Good luck and Godspeed.
So the work has been
Dragon
done.
SpaceX, we confirm nominal
The launch has been completed.
America
has rejoined the ranks of spacefaring nations, launching from its own soil, its own astronauts, its own rockets. We will be returning now to the NASA feed, direct for about another 15 or so minutes. This is Time Magazine reporting from Kennedy Space Center in Florida and the Time headquarters in New York City. We have witnessed history today, and we've witnessed a return to America as a leader in the world of spacefaring nations.
Environmental control and life support system. That's everything controlling their atmosphere, just keeping Dragon a nice, safe, habitable environment where they're going to be living for the next 19 hours until they arrive at the space station.
Right, exactly. And Falcon 9's job may be done for today, but the mission is not over. Crew Dragon's job is not done. As you can see, Bob and Doug are still inside Crew Dragon, making their way. It will be a 19-hour trip to the International Space Station before they dock tomorrow morning. And such cool views. I love that we can get these live views here and see and watch what they're doing now that they are in orbit.
Yeah, it's incredible to just be looking over their shoulder, to be along for the ride. And we're going to be with them, and we're going to be with all of you the entire way for their journey to the space station. We're going to be covering live throughout. Bob and Doug will obviously have a sleep period where they'll get about 8 hours of sleep a little bit later today before they wake up for all of their final approach. One of the major things we are looking forward to in the next couple of hours is going to be their first turn at the controls. So they're actually going to be using those touchscreen displays to take control and manually pilot Dragon. We'll walk you through what that's going to look like, and assuming we have some good ground station coverage, we'll be able to get views from right inside Dragon, looking over their shoulder as they manipulate the controls at the display. But I mean, we had a smooth ride uphill, both stages of the Falcon 9 doing their job, placing Bob and Doug into orbit. I mean, this is a day, this is a historical day. This is us kicking off that new era of space flight that we've all been talking about and longing for since the Space Shuttle program came to an end in 2011.
Yes.
And the weather cooperated.
Yes, second time's a charm.
Right.
All right, so day for the history books. As you can see, we have lost some live signal there, but the mission still continues, and we're going to send it over to KSC to continue broadcasting live with you.
Lost signal, Newfoundland.